Disclaimer.
Right now, at this very moment, you could walk into a commodity exchange in Shanghai and buy physical silver for $80 an ounce, while that exact same metal trades on American exchanges for $35. You'd probably think I'm describing some elaborate scam or a pricing error that I'll get corrected in minutes, but this isn't a glitch in the matrix. This 228% price disconnect has persisted for weeks, and it is revealing something absolutely terrifying about our financial system that most Americans have no idea is happening. Here's what should grab our attention. 8 days ago, on January 1st, China quietly implemented export restrictions that just cut the number of approved silver exporters from hundreds down to only 44 companies. This wasn't some trade dispute making headlines or a tariff war getting presidential tweets. This was a calculated stranglehold executed in silence while Americans celebrated New Year's Eve. And the implications are staggering because China now controls 70% of the world's refined silver production locked inside their borders. Let me put this in perspective with something you need to understand about how our commodity markets actually work. When you see silver trading at $35 an ounce on COMEX, that's the Chicago Mercantile Exchange where American metals trade, you're not looking at the price of physical metal sitting in a warehouse waiting for delivery. According to exchange data, COMEX currently trades 356 paper contracts for every single physical ounce actually stored in their registered vaults. Think about that ratio for a second. For every real ounce of silver that exists in American warehouses, there are 356 promises floating around the financial system, claiming ownership of metal that isn't there. This paper-to-physical ratio isn't some abstract financial concept that only matters to Wall Street traders. This is the mechanism that's about to create a catastrophic shortage affecting every American who owns electronics, drives a car, or uses solar power. When delivery demands spike and people start asking for their actual metal instead of paper promises, the entire system collapses like dominoes. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And our best analysis suggests we're looking at roughly 12 weeks before Western warehouses hit critical depletion levels. Have you noticed how certain financial stories just disappear from mainstream news coverage despite their massive implications? China's January 1st export restrictions got maybe a handful of brief mentions in trade publications. Nothing on cable news, no urgent congressional hearings. Meanwhile, our industrial supply chains are bleeding silver inventory at rates that would shock most Americans if they understood the math. Western warehouses are draining at approximately 12 weeks to depletion based on current consumption rates versus available supply, and we've essentially cut off our largest source of refined metal. Here's where the phantom metal scandal gets truly revealing. The COMEX exchange reports they're holding around 37 million ounces in registered inventory available for delivery. That sounds like a lot of silver until you realize American industrial consumption alone burns through roughly 100 million ounces per month for manufacturing semiconductors, solar panels, medical devices, and electric vehicle components. We're not talking about jewelry or collectible coins here. This is the metal that makes modern technology function. Without steady silver supply, production lines stop, and they stop fast. Think about this scenario. You're a manufacturer in Ohio producing solar panels, and your supplier just called saying the refined silver you need for the next production run is delayed indefinitely because Chinese export approvals are backlogged. You check COMEX futures prices showing $35 per ounce and think maybe you can source metal domestically or from other suppliers. But when you actually try to take physical delivery, you discover there's virtually nothing available at that paper price. The real market, where actual metal changes hands, is trading at multiples of the COMEX quote, assuming you can even find a seller willing to part with physical inventory. This price schizophrenia between Shanghai's $80 physical silver and COMEX's $35 paper contracts proves something deeply unsettling. American buyers have been purchasing phantom silver that does not actually exist in deliverable form. The paper trading system has created an illusion of abundant supply, while the physical metal has quietly concentrated in Chinese vaults and a handful of institutions that understood what was coming. When this illusion breaks, and it will break, the price adjustment won't be gradual or orderly. Let me share what the World Silver Institute's latest data reveals about global supply dynamics. China produces approximately 4,000 metric tons of refined silver annually, which represents about 35% of global mine production. But here's the critical detail most analysis misses. China also refines and processes silver from other countries, meaning their actual control over refined silver ready for industrial use is much higher than raw production numbers suggest. When you factor in China's refining capacity, they control closer to 70% of the world's refined silver supply that is ready to be manufactured into components. The question you should be asking right now is, why would China implement these export restrictions now? It's not like they woke up on January 1st and spontaneously decided to limit silver exports. According to official statements from China's Ministry of Commerce, these restrictions are part of their critical mineral security initiative, placing silver in the same strategic category as rare earth elements. If that phrase sounds familiar, it should. China used nearly identical language back in 2010, before they strangled rare earth exports and watched prices spike tenfold while Western countries scrambled desperately to find alternative supplies. Our government has known about this vulnerability for years. In November 2024, the U.S. Geological Survey officially classified silver as a critical mineral, essential to national security and economic prosperity. The Department of Defense has repeatedly identified silver as a critical material for defense applications in everything from missile guidance systems to next-generation radar technology. Yet despite these classifications and warnings, we've built virtually zero domestic refining capacity to replace Chinese supply. Building new refining facilities takes 4 to 5 years minimum, and we haven't even broken ground on most proposed projects. Here's what keeps me up at night about our current situation. The 44 approved exporters that China left operating are not randomly selected companies. According to supply chain analysts tracking Chinese trade data, these are primarily state-owned enterprises and companies with close government ties. China hasn't just reduced supply, they've centralized control over every ounce of silver leaving their borders, creating a strategic choke point they can tighten or release based on geopolitical calculations that have nothing to do with free market pricing. When delivery demands hit COMEX exchanges and buyers start demanding physical settlement instead of rolling paper contracts forward, the system faces an impossible math problem. You can't deliver 356 ounces of metal when only 1 ounce exists in the vault. The exchange has 2 options: default on physical delivery obligations and force cash settlement at whatever price makes the paper promises go away, or somehow source massive quantities of physical silver at prices far above the current paper quote. Either scenario creates the same outcome: a violent price spike that ripples through every industry dependent on silver supply. What makes this situation different from past commodity squeezes is the intersection of multiple crisis points hitting simultaneously. We're not just dealing with Chinese export restrictions and isolation. Western warehouse inventories were already declining sharply throughout 2024 as industrial demand outpaced new supply. COMEX registered inventory has dropped 70% since 2020, falling from over 120 million ounces down to 37 million ounces today. That depletion happened before China threw up export barriers, meaning we were already approaching critical shortage levels even with Chinese supply flowing freely. The phantom metal scandal, the January 1st silent stranglehold, and the $80 versus $35 price schizophrenia aren't 3 separate problems. They're 3 symptoms of the same structural crisis. Our financial system has been operating on the assumption that paper promises equal physical metal, that Chinese supply would always be available, and that price discovery in commodity markets reflects actual supply and demand. All 3 assumptions are being shattered simultaneously. The consequences are going to reshape how Americans think about resource security and supply chain vulnerability for decades to come. If you think this silver stranglehold scenario sounds too dramatic or conspiratorial, let me show you exactly who has been positioning for this crisis and what their actions reveal about what is really coming. There's a Wall Street institution that's been quietly executing the largest precious metals accumulation in modern financial history, and their strategy tells us everything we need to know about the endgame we're approaching. JPMorgan Chase holds approximately 750 million ounces of physical silver in vaults. That's the largest private stockpile of silver in human history, dwarfing even the strategic reserves held by most governments. But here's what makes this accumulation absolutely fascinating. For decades, leading up to 2020, JPMorgan was doing the exact opposite. According to data from the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, the bank maintained massive short positions in silver futures, essentially betting that silver prices would fall or stay suppressed. Then something changed. Between 2020 and 2023, JPMorgan systematically closed out virtually all of their paper short positions, while simultaneously accumulating physical metal at a pace that has never been seen before in commodity markets. Think about what it means when America's largest bank executes a complete strategic reversal in the silver market. This is not some hedge fund taking a speculative position or a mining company hedging production. This is an institution with access to the deepest intelligence networks in global finance. An institution that sits on Federal Reserve advisory committees and has relationships with every major central bank on the planet. When JPMorgan flips from suppressing silver prices with paper shorts to accumulating the largest physical hoard in history, they're not making a casual investment decision. They're positioning for a paradigm shift in how silver is valued and traded. The blueprint they're following comes from one of the most infamous commodity corners in American history, the Hunt brothers' attempt to corner the silver market in 1980. Nelson Bunker Hunt and William Herbert Hunt accumulated over 200 million ounces of silver through futures contracts and physical purchases. driving prices from $6 per ounce to over $50 in just months. But here's where the Hunt brothers made their critical mistake. They relied heavily on leveraged futures contracts rather than outright physical ownership. When exchanges changed margin requirements and forced liquidation, the Hunt empire collapsed. They declared bankruptcy, and silver prices crashed back to earth. JPMorgan clearly studied that failure in excruciating detail, because their current strategy is the Hunt Brothers 2.0 playbook, with one crucial difference. They're holding actual physical metal stored in allocated vaults, not leveraged paper contracts that exchanges can force them to liquidate through rule changes. According to Precious Metals, analysts tracking vault movements, JPMorgan has been taking delivery of physical silver from COMEX warehouses month after month, year after year, building a position that can't be unwound by regulatory intervention or margin calls. They learned the lesson. Paper contracts are weapons that can be used against you, but physical metal in your possession is power that nobody can take away. Have you noticed how certain financial moves only make sense in hindsight when the crisis they were preparing for actually materializes? In 2010, China controlled 97% of global rare earth element production, materials essential for manufacturing everything from smartphones to fighter jets to wind turbines. Then, they suddenly implemented export restrictions, citing environmental concerns and strategic resource management. Within months, rare earth prices spiked by 10 times their previous levels. Neodymium went from $40 per kilogram to $400. Dysprosium jumped from $200 to $2,000 per kilogram. Western governments responded with urgent declarations that this would never happen again. The Obama administration launched initiatives to restart American rare earth mining and processing. Japan invested billions in alternative supply chains. The European Union designated rare earths as critical materials requiring strategic stockpiles. But here's the absolutely damning truth. 15 years later, China still controls over 70% of global rare earth refining capacity. Despite all the promises and initiatives and strategic declarations, we built virtually nothing. A handful of mines opened in the United States and Australia, but refining capacity, the actual bottleneck that matters, remained concentrated in China. Now, watch China execute the exact same playbook with silver, and watch Western governments respond with the exact same pattern of urgent rhetoric followed by inadequate action. The Ministry of Commerce. As January 1st, export restrictions are using nearly identical language to the 2010 rare earth restrictions: strategic resource security, environmental protection, sustainable development. China knows from experience that Western countries will complain loudly, promise to build alternative supply chains, hold congressional hearings about supply chain vulnerability, and then ultimately do nothing fast enough to matter. The timeline for building refining infrastructure is 4 to 5 years minimum, and that assumes permits get approved quickly and financing is readily available, neither of which is a safe assumption in our current regulatory environment. Let me show you the panic signal that confirms insiders know exactly what's coming. India is the world's largest consumer of silver for jewelry, religious items, and increasingly for industrial applications like solar panels. Indian silver imports typically run around 6,000 to 7,000 metric tons per year, spread relatively evenly across 12 months. But in October 2024 alone, India imported 1,715 metric tons, nearly a quarter of their typical annual imports concentrated into a single month. That's not normal buying behavior, that's front-running. According to commodity traders who monitor Indian precious metals markets, this unprecedented surge came from a combination of jewelry manufacturers, industrial buyers, and investment funds, all scrambling to secure physical silver before Chinese export restrictions fully materialized. When you see the world's most sophisticated silver buyers, traders who've been in these markets for generations, who have relationships with suppliers across Asia, who understand supply chain dynamics better than any Western analyst, when you see them panic buying at premium prices, that tells you something catastrophic is coming down the pipeline. The Indian buying surge reveals another critical aspect of this crisis that most Americans don't understand. Global silver markets operate on trust and relationships built over decades, and those relationships are breaking down rapidly. Indian buyers have historically sourced significant silver from Chinese refiners because China offered competitive prices, reliable delivery, and quality metal. But starting in late 2024, Indian traders began reporting delivery delays, canceled contracts, and Chinese suppliers simply refusing to quote prices for future deliveries regardless of offered premiums. This was then about price negotiation. Chinese suppliers were being told not to commit metal for export because domestic priorities were taking precedence. Think about your own experience trying to buy anything during a shortage crisis. Remember the toilet paper panic of 2020, or trying to buy a PlayStation 5 or graphics card when semiconductor shortages hit? Now imagine that dynamic playing out with an industrial commodity that's essential to manufacturing hundreds of products, where there's no substitute material that works as well, and where the supply disruption isn't temporary shipping delays, but deliberate government policy restricting exports indefinitely. That's the situation developing in global silver markets right now, except it's largely invisible to American consumers, because the crisis is still working its way through industrial supply chains that most people never think about. JPMorgan's accumulation strategy makes perfect sense when you understand they're not trying to corner the market like the Hunt brothers did. They're simply positioning to be the supplier of last resort when Western warehouses run dry and industrial manufacturers become desperate. According to data from the Silver Institute, global industrial silver demand runs around 600 million ounces annually, with approximately 100 million ounces of that coming from U.S. manufacturers. When Chinese export restrictions choke off supply and COMEX warehouses near depletion, manufacturers will pay any price to keep production lines running. A solar panel manufacturer in California, facing a choice between paying double or triple spot prices for silver versus shutting down their factory and laying off workers, is going to pay the premium every single time. The rare earths playbook is not just a historical parallel, it's a proven strategy that China has successfully executed before with minimal consequences. After the 2010 export restrictions, did China face sanctions? No. Did Western countries successfully diversify supply chains fast enough to matter? No. Did rare earth prices eventually come down? Yes, but only after years of elevated prices that transferred enormous wealth from Western manufacturers to Chinese suppliers and the few Western entities smart enough to stockpile before the crisis hit. China learned they can execute strategic resource restrictions, achieve their geopolitical and economic objectives, and face minimal lasting consequences, because Western supply chain adaptation moves far too slowly to punish the strategy. What's different this time is the scale of industrial dependency on silver compared to rare earths. Rare earth elements are critical for specific high-tech applications, but silver is ubiquitous across our entire industrial economy. Every smartphone contains approximately 1/3 of a gram of silver. Solar panels use up to 20 grams per panel. Electric vehicles require up to 50 grams each. Medical devices, from X-ray machines to bandages, depend on silver's unique antibacterial and conductive properties. When you restrict rare earth supply, you impact specific industries. When you restrict silver supply, you threaten the entire technological foundation of modern civilization. India's October buying surge wasn't just jewelry manufacturers and industrial consumers. It also included significant purchases by the Reserve Bank of India and government-directed strategic stockpiling. When you see central banks and sovereign entities front-running a commodity shortage, that's the strongest possible signal that the crisis is real and imminent. Central banks don't panic buy based on speculation or market rumors. They act on intelligence from diplomatic channels, trade ministry data, and strategic assessments that aren't available to private market participants. If the Reserve Bank of India was directing emergency silver purchases in October, they knew something about Chinese export policy that hadn't been publicly announced yet, and they moved to secure supply before the window closed. The proof isn't just in the numbers and institutional actions, it's in the silence. Have you heard any major financial news networks covering this story in depth? Has your congressman held hearings about strategic silver reserves? Has the Federal Reserve mentioned silver supply disruptions in any of their recent economic assessments? The absence of public alarm from official channels does not mean the crisis is not real. It means the crisis is so serious that acknowledging it publicly would accelerate the panic they are trying to prevent. When you see JPMorgan's physical accumulation, China's rare earths playbook repeating, and India's front-running behavior all converging simultaneously while mainstream coverage remains eerily quiet, you're watching a crisis unfold in slow motion before the general public realizes what's happening. Let me walk you through the math that keeps commodity analysts awake at night, because once you see these numbers, you'll understand why the timeline to crisis is measured in weeks, not months or years. COMEX registered inventory. That's silver available for immediate delivery to settle futures contracts, currently sits at approximately 37 million ounces. That number has been declining steadily throughout 2024 and 2025, down 70% from the 120 million ounces that sat in registered vaults back in 2020. Every month, more metal gets withdrawn than deposited, creating a one-way drain that's accelerating as industrial buyers recognize the shortage developing. Now let's look at the other side of the equation, consumption. American industrial demand alone consumes roughly 100 million ounces per month across all applications. Semiconductors, solar panels, medical devices, batteries, electrical contacts, and hundreds of other manufacturing processes. Global industrial consumption runs about 600 million ounces annually, which breaks down to 50 million ounces per month worldwide. These aren't flexible numbers that manufacturers can easily adjust downward. You can't build a solar panel with 80% of the silver it requires and hope it works almost as well. You can't manufacture semiconductors with silver substitute materials and expect them to function properly. Industrial silver demand is remarkably inelastic because the metal's unique properties, highest electrical conductivity of any element, highest thermal conductivity, excellent reflectivity, make it irreplaceable in most applications. Here's where the math becomes unavoidable. If COMEX registered inventory stands at 37 million ounces, and we're draining roughly 3 to 5 million ounces per month from those warehouses to meet delivery demands, we hit zero inventory in approximately 7.5 to 12 weeks, depending on whether the drain rate accelerates. That puts us at a critical depletion point right around the last week of March 2026. Specifically, our analysis suggests March 28th as the date when COMEX warehouses could hit functionally zero registered inventory available for delivery. Think about what happens when a major commodity exchange runs out of physical metal to deliver against outstanding futures contracts. This isn't a theoretical scenario. We have historical precedents. In 2021, the London Metal Exchange faced a nickel short squeeze that forced them to cancel trades and shut down the market temporarily when a Chinese company could not meet delivery obligations. The chaos that ensued saw nickel prices briefly spike to over $100,000 per metric ton before the exchange intervened to prevent total market collapse. But that was nickel, a metal with relatively limited industrial applications compared to silver. When COMEX faces the same situation with silver, a metal that's absolutely critical to our entire technological infrastructure, the consequences will be far more severe and far-reaching. The exchange has only two options when they can't deliver physical metal: force cash settlement at whatever price makes the paper contracts go away, or somehow source massive quantities of physical silver at prices far above current quotes to satisfy delivery demands. Either path leads to the same destination: a violent price spike that forces the paper market price to converge with the physical market reality. When you have got buyers willing to pay $80 an ounce in Shanghai for physical metal, while COMEX paper contracts quote $35, that $45 spread tells you exactly how far prices need to rise to reflect actual supply scarcity. But March 28th is not just significant because of warehouse depletion mathematics. It's the convergence point for three separate crisis triggers hitting simultaneously. Let me show you how these cascading events amplify each other to create a perfect storm. First, you've got the warehouse depletion we just discussed reaching critical levels. Second, you've got JPMorgan's position allowing them to demand physical delivery on existing contracts, forcing COMEX into default scenarios. And third, you've got solar panel manufacturers facing production shutdowns right as spring installation season begins, creating desperate demand for silver at any price. Solar manufacturers operate on seasonal cycles, with spring and summer representing their peak installation periods when weather conditions are optimal and demand from residential and commercial customers surges. If you're a solar manufacturer and March arrives with your silver supply chain broken, you're not facing a temporary inconvenience, you're facing the complete loss of your most profitable quarters. According to the Solar Energy Industries Association, U.S. solar installations typically run about 30% higher in Q2 compared to Q1 as weather improves and construction activity accelerates. Missing that window means missing annual revenue targets, potentially defaulting on financing agreements, and watching competitors who secured silver supply capture your market share. Manufacturing executives understand this timing pressure intimately, which means they'll pay whatever price is necessary to secure silver inventory before the March crunch point. We're not talking about negotiating a 10 or 20% premium. We're talking about manufacturers willing to pay double or triple spot prices because the alternative is shutting down production lines and laying off their workforce. When you have got factories with hundreds of millions of dollars in capital equipment sitting idle because you can't source a few thousand ounces of silver, paying $150 or $200 per ounce instead of $35 becomes an easy decision. The math is brutal but simple. Losing a few $1 million on inflated silver costs beats losing tens or hundreds of millions in lost production and market share. JPMorgan's 750 million ounce stockpile becomes incredibly powerful in this context, because they're positioned to be the supplier that keeps American manufacturers operating when Chinese supply is restricted and COMEX warehouses are empty. Think about the negotiating leverage that creates. A desperate manufacturer needs silver immediately or faces production shutdown. COMEX can't deliver physical metal. Chinese suppliers won't ship under export restrictions. And JPMorgan happens to have the largest private stockpile in history sitting in vaults. What price do you think that manufacturer agrees to pay? Whatever JPMorgan asks, because the alternative is existential threat to their business. This is not price gouging or market manipulation. It's basic supply and demand dynamics operating in a crisis environment. JPMorgan spent years and billions of dollars accumulating this position when silver was undervalued and readily available. They took the risk that this supply crisis would eventually materialize, and they're going to profit enormously when it does. That's not illegal or unethical. It's strategic resource accumulation based on superior market intelligence and long-term thinking that most market participants simply do and execute. Now, let me show you why America is completely checkmated in this scenario, despite our government recognizing the problem. In November 2024, the U.S. Geological Survey officially added silver to the list of critical minerals essential to national security, joining rare earth elements, lithium, cobalt, and other strategically important materials. The Department of Energy has identified silver as crucial for solar energy goals. The Department of Defense has recognized silver's importance for military electronics and communication systems. Our government isn't ignorant about this vulnerability. They've documented it extensively in official reports and strategic assessments. But here's the devastating reality. We have virtually zero domestic silver refining capacity to replace Chinese supply. The United States produces approximately 1,000 metric tons of silver annually from domestic mining operations, but almost all of that ore gets shipped overseas for refining because we lack the infrastructure to process it domestically. Building new refining facilities requires 4 to 5 years minimum from initial permitting through construction to operational startup. Even if we broke ground tomorrow on a crash program to build domestic refining capacity, we wouldn't see significant output until 2029 or 2030 at the earliest. China knows this timeline intimately because they've watched us fail to build alternative supply chains for rare earth elements despite 15 years of warnings and initiatives. They understand that American political and regulatory systems move far too slowly to respond effectively to resource supply shocks. Environmental permitting alone for a new refining facility can take 2 to 3 years, assuming no legal challenges from local opposition groups or environmental organizations. Then you need to secure financing, construct the facility, hire and train specialized workers, establish supply chains for processing chemicals and equipment, and complete operational testing before producing commercial-grade refined silver. Every step of that process faces delays, cost overruns, and potential obstacles that extend timelines beyond the critical shortage period we're entering. What this means in practical terms is that America must either pay China's price for refined silver or watch critical industrial sectors struggle with supply shortages that cascade through our economy. Semiconductor manufacturers need silver for die bonding and electrical contacts. Solar panel producers need silver for photovoltaic cells. Electric vehicle manufacturers need silver for electrical systems, motors, and battery connections. Medical device companies need silver for antimicrobial coatings and imaging equipment. These aren't luxury goods or optional technologies. They're foundational elements of our economic competitiveness and technological infrastructure. The checkmate becomes complete when you realize that paying higher prices for Chinese silver does not just increase costs, it transfers enormous wealth from American manufacturers and consumers to Chinese suppliers and the Chinese government through export taxes and strategic positioning. Every dollar of premium we pay above historical silver prices represents wealth transfer from our economy to theirs, weakening our industrial base while strengthening their strategic position. And there's absolutely nothing we can do to avoid this wealth transfer in the short to medium term because we lack alternative supply sources and can't build them fast enough to matter. Think about how this plays out at the consumer level, because these industrial supply shocks don't stay confined to manufacturers and commodity traders. They flow through to everyday Americans in concrete ways. Solar panel prices are going to spike as manufacturers pass along inflated silver costs, making residential solar installations more expensive, right as we're trying to expand renewable energy adoption. Electronics prices will climb as semiconductor costs increase. Electric vehicle prices could rise as manufacturers struggle with battery and electrical system component costs. Medical procedures requiring silver-based devices or imaging equipment may see cost increases. The inflation is not theoretical or confined to financial markets. It's coming directly to your wallet through products and services you use every day. But here's what you need to understand about this crisis that separates it from typical commodity price spikes. The wealth transfer and economic dislocation we're facing was entirely preventable. We had 15 years of warnings from the rare earth crisis. We had multiple government reports identifying silver as strategically critical. We had industry groups and analysts warning about growing dependence on Chinese refining capacity. Yet we built nothing. We diversified nothing. We created no strategic stockpiles, no domestic refining alternatives, no backup supply chains. Every dollar we're about to lose every percentage point of inflation that's coming in every manufacturer that struggles or fails because they can't secure silver supply. All of it was avoidable with strategic planning and investment we chose not to make. The week of March 24th through 28th represents the convergence point where mathematical inevitability meets strategic positioning meets industrial desperation. That's when warehouse depletion reaches critical levels, when JPMorgan's ability to demand physical delivery forces COMEX into crisis decisions, when solar manufacturers face their moment of truth about securing supply for peak season. The specific date is not guaranteed. It could arrive a week earlier or a week later, depending on variables like delivery demand patterns and potential emergency interventions. But the direction and approximate timing are locked in by mathematics that can't be negotiated or wished away. Our current silver price of $35 an ounce is going to look quaint when this crisis fully materializes. Physical silver in Shanghai already trades at $80, and that's before Western warehouse depletion forces desperate buying. Conservative estimates based on industrial replacement demand and supply scarcity suggest silver could spike to $150 to $200 per ounce during acute shortage periods. That's not speculation or hype. It's basic economics of essential commodities with inelastic demand facing supply disruption. When manufacturers will pay any price to avoid production shutdown, prices rise until supply and demand balance at whatever level makes marginal buyers drop out. At $150 to $200 per ounce, some industrial applications become economically unviable and demand destruction begins. But critical applications, semiconductors, solar, medical devices, will keep buying regardless of cost. The American checkmate endgame isn't about our country collapsing or our economy grinding to a halt. We're going to keep manufacturing semiconductors and solar panels and medical devices. Our industrial base will survive this crisis, but we're going to pay an enormous premium for that survival, transferring wealth to Chinese suppliers and the handful of Western entities like JPMorgan that positioned intelligently for this shortage. The question every American should be asking isn't whether this crisis arrives. The math proves it's coming. The question is why our strategic planning failed so completely to prevent a predictable resource shortage, and what we're going to do differently to prevent the next one. Because China isn't stopping with silver. They're applying this same strategic resource control playbook to lithium refining, to cobalt processing, to other critical minerals our economy depends on. Each time we fail to build alternative supply chains, and each time we allow critical resource dependencies to concentrate in a single country, we're setting up the next checkmate scenario. The silver crisis arriving in March is a lesson in the costs of strategic complacency, a lesson that is going to be taught in real dollars, real inflation, and real economic pain that American families will feel directly in their daily lives.